I want to welcome everyone to our last in-person seminar of the semester. This one is also co-hosted by the Software and Societal Systems Department. So I want to thank Patrick Park. I don't know if Patrick's here. Hey, Patrick, and his great students who help organize the Computational Social Science Seminar for the opportunity to continue to collaborate in these types of activities. Today, we're lucky to have with us a collaborator of many within the Institute and outside the Institute, someone who's doing great work at the intersection of machine learning and psychology. Tom Griffiths is a professor of psychology and computer science at Princeton and is the director of the Computational Cognitive Science Lab, as well as the Princeton Laboratory for Artificial Intelligence. So he's on a tour to CMU of sorts as far as giving talks. This is his second in as many days. And I'm sure we've all been looking forward to his talk today on using machine learning and psychology to predict and understand human decisions. So please join me in welcoming Tom.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm sorry, I'm adjusting the Zoom. Okay. I'm particularly excited to have the chance to talk to this group and the institute that you have here, which is very much at the intersection of my various interests. I don't think I have to explain to this group why it's interesting to think about human decision-making, right? So decision-making is not just at the foundation of our okay. Okay, that's it? Yeah, good. Okay. Not just at the foundation of our economy, but it's also something that it's worth trying to understand if you want to build systems that are going to interact with human beings, right? So if you want to build any kind of system which is going to try and make inferences about what it is that humans want, it's helpful to have a forward model of how it is that people make decisions in order to be able to work backwards and figure out what it is that motivated the actions that somebody made in terms of their preferences and their goals and so on. And if these stakes aren't high enough for you, there are other situations where understanding things about human decision-making are particularly important, right? So if you're trying to build self-driving cars, you want to build vehicles that are able to make inferences about things like what people might be able to see and what they might not be able to see, and interpret those things from the way in which drivers are behaving on the road. And so, again, aspects about human decision-making are critical to designing these kinds of systems too. So despite that importance, we're in a funny situation when we think about applying machine learning to understanding human behavior, where often when we're trying to make models of how it is people make decisions, predict the decisions that people make, try and understand those decisions, we're doing so with kind of off-the-shelf machine learning methods, right? There aren't necessarily special methods that we've developed in the context of human behavior that are things that are more effective than the kinds of off-the-shelf methods we might use. So to put this in the language of machine learning, we don't have systems that have inductive biases that are particularly designed for making sense of human behavior. So inductive bias is everything other than the data that influences what a system learns. Here's my obligatory reference to Tom Mitchell, right here at CMU. Right. So if we think about what kinds of inductive biases we engineer into our machine learning systems, we build machine learning systems that are good at doing things like learning what to do with images, right? Like convolutional neural networks that have inductive biases that capture things like translation and variance of images. We build systems that have good inductive biases for learning things about the kinds of regularities that appear in sequences that allow us to capture language, whether it's things like LSTMs or transformers. But we don't necessarily have machine learning systems that are particularly, well designed for trying to make sense of human behavior. So one way of thinking about what I'm going to talk about today is talking about this question of how it is that we can think about how to incorporate better inductive biases into machine learning systems for making sense of human behavior. And part of that argument is going to be that maybe one of the places that we can get those inductive biases from is from psychology, right? From the fact that there have been people who've thought hard about how it is that we might make sense of human decision-making for a long time. And that some of those kinds of methods might be things that we can use for thinking about how to create systems that have good inductive biases for predicting human behavior. So I'm going to engage with two questions. One of these questions is how it is that theories from psychology could aid in developing machine learning models. And then the second question is about if we are able to make those machine learning models that are able to make good predictions about human behavior, are we able to go beyond that to be able to ultimately explain and not just predict human behavior? Something which is relevant for, if we're trying to do, say, the kind of project that psychologists have been engaged in for a long time of just trying to make sense of what people do rather than just trying to make predictions about the way in which they behave. So what I'm going to do in the talk today is go through 3 methods that we've used in my lab over a period of about 6 or 7 years that we've developed for combining psychological theory with data to end up with models that do a better job of predicting human decisions and ultimately, hopefully, helping us to understand better why it is that people make those decisions. So the first of these methods is theory-based pre-training. I'll explain what that means in a moment. The second is differentiable theories, which is a way of constructing psychological theories that have meaningful cognitive constraints, but are built using the toolbox of modern machine learning. And then the third is a method we call scientific regret minimization, which is a way of using the fact that we have a good predictive model to then work towards having a better explanatory model. And the main sort of case that I'm going to consider in presenting these different approaches is one that's motivated by thinking about this kind of financial decision making, right, where we're weighing the different outcomes that can occur and the probabilities that are associated with those, or at least how that manifests in the psychology lab, which is in the context of this kind of risky choice task. So the risky choice task, you're making a choice between 2 alternatives. Those alternatives correspond to different gambles. Those gambles have different payoffs and different probabilities that are associated with those payoffs. So in this case, if you choose option A, you get $16 with certainty. You choose option B, you get $1 with probability 0.6, $44 with probability 0.1, 48 with probability 0.1, 50 with probability 0.2. You could think about what decision you'd make in this situation. But the question is how it is that people combine these probabilities and the associated payoffs when they're trying to make a decision between those 2 gambles. So part of the reason why I'm going to focus on this case is not just that it's a foundational problem that's being considered in trying to understand human decision-making, and in fact, the origin of a lot of the kinds of classic theories that psychologists have come up with, but that it's also a case where people started to ask this question of how machine learning might be used to come up with better predictions about human behavior. And so all the way back in 2015, Ido Erev and colleagues ran a choice prediction competition where they took this kind of paradigm and they ran a bunch of studies where they had people come into the lab and make these choices. And they did this between 90 pairs of these gambles. And then they evaluated the predictions of a variety of models from psychology and machine learning with another 30 pairs of gambles. And what they found when they did that was that the machine learning methods did less well than psychological models in making predictions about what choices people would make. And the best models were always ones that were somehow informed by psychological theory. And so these results inspired us to start thinking about, is there a way that we can do better than that, right? Is there a way that we can actually make machine learning systems that can do a better job of predicting people's choices in these kinds of scenarios? And so they held a second choice prediction competition 3 years later in 2018. And in the context of thinking about how to solve that problem, we developed the first of the methods I'm going to talk about, which is this method of theory-based pre-training. And the idea here is super simple. I only have like 1 slide about this method because it's so simple. I think in the modern world of pre-trained neural networks, this is sort of an obvious thing to do. But the basic idea is the problem that we have in this situation is that we have a relatively small amount of actual human choice data, right? So I said there's like, in their original experiment, there were about 90 of these gambles that we used as training data and 30 that we used as test. In the subsequent version of the choice prediction competition, it got sort of closer to 300 gambles total. But the issue that we have is that we have this very small amount of data that we're going to use to try and train a model to predict what's a relatively complex behavior, right? And you can think about that relatively complex behavior in terms of we were trying to learn a mapping from the parameters of these gambles in terms of the probabilities and utilities that are associated with those outcomes to the choice that the people are actually making, right? And so that's a relatively high dimensional function that we're trying to estimate. And so the trick that we used was there's an easy way to get more data to figure out what this mapping looks like, which is if we've already got a pretty good psychological theory, we can take that psychological theory, generate a bunch of data from that psychological theory, use that to pre-train our neural network, and then having pre-trained the neural network in that way, then we just fine-tune the neural network on the actual human data that we have, right? And so this is, it's like in the modern world of machine learning, this is a sim to real sort of transfer problem, right? Where we're using synthetic data to basically dispose our machine learning model towards a particular solution, and then we're using our real data to transfer to this to the setting which we actually care about making predictions in. And so this very simple thing where we're using a psychological theory to create the training data that we're using to then end up producing a neural network, which is going to do a better job to bias our neural network towards solutions that correspond to that psychological theory, turns out to work way better than any other kind of method that's been applied to these kinds of data. Using this kind of method, we're able to beat all of the kinds of things that have been applied to the original choice prediction competition. And then when we apply this to the 2018 choice prediction competition, again, we do better than all of the methods that have been used there. We do better than the winner of the 2018 choice prediction competition, which was also us. So we accidentally, my student who was submitting our submission to the competition, accidentally submitted our second best method rather than our best method, which is this one, and it still won the competition, but we could do even better than that, and that was the thing that we focused on in the paper. Okay, so this is thing number one, right? If we want to make a model that has a good inductive bias for predicting human decisions, a way that you can do that is by creating a model which is pre-trained on synthetic data that comes from a psychological theory that characterizes the kind of thing that we think people do. And so this is a way that we can use psychological theory to improve the machine learning methods that we might use for generating predictions about human behavior. But the real problem here is that problem that I was outlining, which is that we just didn't have enough human data, right? If we really want to be able to turn this into a problem that we're able to solve using these machine learning methods, it would be very helpful to have more data. And as a consequence of using the simulated data in this setting, we could calculate exactly how much data we thought we needed. And as a consequence, we went out and just collected that much data. And so what we did was we went from those 300 gambles that were used in that choice prediction competition to a data set of 13,000 pairs of gambles. And for each of those gambles, we got 20 choices from participants that we recruited on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And so the sort of radical thing that we're doing here is just massively increasing the amount of data that we're using for trying to make sense of human decisions. So we're going from 300 gambles to 13,000, sort of roughly, 2 orders of magnitude increase in the amount of data that we have. To visualize this, this is a 2-dimensional representation of that space of possible gambles that's extracted from one of the neural network models that we use, and I'll sort of explain what the model is in a moment. But you can think about this as kind of capturing the similarity between the different gambles in this low-dimensional space. The green X's here correspond to the historical gambles that have previously been used in developing theories of how people make these kinds of decisions. So if you think to like Kalman and Tversky, prospect theory, these kinds of models, they were based on these green X's. The red dots are the previous largest data set. This is the choice prediction competition data set. And then the black dots correspond to the data set that we collected. And so we're able to, find parts of this space that hadn't previously been sampled, as well as fill in gaps between these things and end up with a data set that gives us a much richer picture of the entire space of these possible gambles, rather than these, specific points within that space that have been selected in previous experiments. So from the psychology end of things, this is a very different way of thinking about how we collect data, right? So the psychologist's method of collecting data is you come up with a couple of theories. Those theories make different predictions. You try and identify, stimuli that you can use that elicit those different predictions, and then use that to design your experiment, go run your experiment, get back the information about which model fits best, and then make a conclusion about which of those 2 hypotheses is true, right? That's how you're supposed to do experiments as a psychologist. We're doing experiments in the way that's much more like how a computer scientist approaches this problem, which is we want to estimate a function over a space. The way we're going to do that is by sampling that space densely. And then we got enough data that we can use to then train a machine learning model in a non-parametric way to approximate that underlying function. And so, for the psychologists, this is just a thing to think about. I think most of the time when we collect psychological data, we're collecting way too little psychological data. And as a consequence, we come up with way too simple explanations for what's going on in our data set. And as we go through the talk, I'll sort of illustrate how this changes the way that we might think about theory in this particular setting, but also thinking about theory more generally in psychology. Okay, so now we have this big data set, it changes what we're able to do. So in the previous case, we had to use those psychological theories to bias our model towards particular solutions. In this case, we have enough data that we're able to apply machine learning methods out of the box. And what we're interested in is using this conception of the problem in terms of learning a function that maps us from this space of gambles to the probability that people make a choice as a way of now specifying a set of models that make meaningful psychological distinctions, but allow us to use the tools of modern machine learning. And so the way that we do this is by thinking about, if you start thinking about this problem in terms of this space of functions, you can think about the relationships that exist between different classes of functions in this space. And so classic theories of decision-making, like expected value, expected utility, prospect theory, all correspond to sort of sets of functions that you can define, and I'll go through in a moment how those are defined. And then as a consequence of defining those different sets of functions that represent different psychological assumptions, we can then use the fact that those functions end up being differentiable to express those theories as different computation graphs, and then use automatic differentiation tools that are common in machine learning to allow us to find the function within that constrained class that corresponds to that psychological theory that best fits our data. And in doing so, sort of test how well can that kind of theory make sense of the data that we've collected. And so to explain a little more how this works, what we're doing is essentially exhaustively evaluating models within different theoretical classes. So the first of these classes is expected utility theory. So expected utility theory assumes a particular functional form for the probability that people choose, say, gamble A, where that functional form is specified in terms of the expected utility, which is associated with that gamble, as well as the expected utility that's associated with the other gamble, right? And that expected utility is the probability of each outcome multiplied by the utility, which is assigned to that outcome by people, with the assumption that that utility is something like a sort of saturating curve like this. So that's a way of describing a particular sort of model of choice. But it's also, if we look at it, if you're sort of applying a machine learning lens, you can say, okay, that's a softmax of a particular, sort of weighted average of some values. We can draw that out as, a kind of computation graph. And instead of having this function be some pre-specified form of saturating function, we can allow that function to be defined by a simple neural network, right? And so now we have completely free non-parametric form for this function that relates the outcomes to the utilities associated with those outcomes. We learn the form of that function by fitting this model, which translates the expected utilities that result from that particular utility function into a probability of making that choice. And this whole description of this function is differentiable. And as a consequence, we can optimize this by sort of backpropagating through this entire model. And then we can find the best model that fits within this class. Make sense? Yeah, okay. We can do the same thing for other kinds of models of choice, right? So prospect theory. So now we're going to have a utility function which is sensitive to the difference between losses and gains. And we're going to have a subjective probability weighting function, which allows us to do things like overweight small probabilities. I don't need to go through these kinds of examples that are sort of why we need these things for this audience, I think, but they allow us to capture things like loss aversion, where people are more sensitive to losses than gains in terms of the steepness of the curve for losses relative to the curve for gains. And again, this sort of overweighting of small probabilities. In addition to these sort of psychologically motivated sort of classic theories, we can think about other ways that we can specify the functional form of that relationship. And so one of these is just what we call a value-based choice model, where here the idea is that we're going to allow people to calculate a value for each gamble, but we're not going to constrain the form of that calculation, right? So prospect theory says that this still has a form that's kind of like an expectation. Here we'll say, let's allow this to be an arbitrary function But we're still going to assume that there's some function that you're using to convert each gamble into a value, and then you're making a decision by comparing those values. And then finally, what we call a context-dependent choice model. This is a completely unconstrained neural network. All that it takes in is the probabilities and outcomes, and then from that, it calculates the probability that you choose the particular gamble. And so this is allowing essentially the features of one gamble to influence the features of the other gamble in the way that they're combined together to allow you to calculate that final probability.
Clarification.
Yeah.
And the goal is to match human choice.
Yep.
At the individual or at the aggregate?
It's the aggregate level in this case, but I'll show you. I can talk about individual differences later. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, good question. I'm going to go through the results for the classic models first, just so you get a sense of how this works. So this is exactly what we're saying. This is looking at how well you match the aggregate. So this is the test set, mean squared error. This is all done with held out data. So this is a generalization performance where we're looking at the mean squared error to the proportion of people who select option A and for that particular choice between gambles. And then this is the proportion of our data set, which is used in training the model. And then these gray lines correspond to functional forms for the utility curve that have been proposed by humans. And the blue line corresponds to learning that functional form for the utility curve using this, just sort of non-parametric neural network. And so the observation here is that, once you get to about 20% of the way through our data set, you've got enough information that the neural network is able to figure out a utility function that is at least as good and perhaps slightly better than the best utility functional forms that human beings have come up with, right? Yeah.
Is this is the test set exactly the same task as the training set?
Yeah, but it's other instances that are sampled from that same distribution.
You know how it generalizes to similar behavior but different tasks?
Not for this case. So these models are constrained to do this mapping from this space, which is parameterized in terms of probabilities and outcomes, but I'll come back to that at the end. Yeah. Okay, and so we can sort of look at the form of the utility function, so it seems reasonable. Then this is the same thing now for prospect theory. There are many more lines here because we're considering the cross of proposed probability weighting functions and utility functions, but it's the same story where now it sort of takes maybe like 40% of our data set, but once you get that far into the data set, you're now producing something which is at least as good as and perhaps better than the best models that human beings have come up with. And this looks sort of right. This looks not quite like what we expected, and I'll come back and talk about that later on. Okay, so the first thing to take away from this slide, right, is that getting to the point where people had these models took, about 30 years of experimentation, right? Coming up with those carefully designed, let's try this one, let's try this one. Here's two hypotheses, let's contrast them. And those 30 years of experimentation, we're able to replace with a single experiment, as long as we have enough data, and then doing this kind of automated search of this space of functions. We can then go beyond this and we can ask, what are we missing in the data? What is it that these models don't capture? And so this is now these are the lines that I showed you before. And now we have these less constrained models, the value-based model, which is estimating a value that's associated with each gamble and then combining those together. This gray line is the best existing psychological model. This is the BEAST model. This is the winner of the 2015 choice prediction competition. And I should say they subsequently figured out that they could make this even slightly better, which brings this line down a little bit. And then this pink purple line is the context-dependent model, which this is the model which is just learning that unconstrained neural network that maps the properties of the gamble to the probability of making a choice. Okay, so the things to take away from this are, first of all, having more data obviously makes a difference in the conclusions that we draw about what function classes sort of are effective in explaining the data. It's worth pointing out that the previous largest data set was over here, right? This is the choice prediction competition from 2018. And if we look over here, it's definitely the case that the best performing models are things like, cumulative prospect theory, which, based on the amount of data we had, that was a reasonable conclusion that psychologically motivated models were the best models we had for predicting people's choices. But as we get more data, we can take these less constrained models and we can discover that, in fact, there's a big chunk of variance that is unexplained in people's choices that's not being captured by our existing psychological models. And so we've discovered that we can make a better model in terms of predicting the choices that people make than the best psychological model we've come up with. But we now have a new problem, which is what the heck is this thing doing, right? And can we figure out exactly, what's accounting for that difference in variance? Okay, so this brings us to the third method, scientific regret minimization. And here the idea is to use a black box model to critique an interpretable model. And the reason we call this scientific regret minimization is that the intuition is that if you're trying to, if you're critiquing a model, then, if you're focusing in on the errors that the model is making, you shouldn't treat every error equally. You should care more about the errors that you could have avoided making. And having a black box model tells you which errors you could have avoided, right? So having a model which is a purely predictive model gives you information about what were things that were predictable in your data set that you might have missed. And by focusing on those things, that gives us information that's particularly good for figuring out what we should be doing and trying to create our more interpretable sort of theoretical explanatory model. Okay, so I'll show you an example of this first in another domain. Right, this is a domain that's motivated by this self-driving car example, and we're using a data set here from Awad and colleagues. This is the moral machine data set. It's published in 2018 in Nature, and this is a very large data set that basically involved asking people on the internet to solve trolley problems, right? So the form of these trolley problems was, at least for the subset of the data that we looked at, which is about 10 million human decisions, there's a self-driving car. The car is approaching a crosswalk. There are people on the crosswalk. The car's brakes have failed. It's going to hit one side of the crosswalk or the other. You have to make a decision whether it's more morally acceptable for the car to continue straight, in which case it will kill these people, or for it to swerve, in which case it kills these people, right? So these are all horrible scenarios. They're not things that's fun to think about. Nonetheless, people have very clear intuitions about which things are more or less morally acceptable. Okay, all right. So we can think about modeling these moral decisions in a couple of ways. So if we kind of look at the literature on moral decision-making, we can think about using the fact that each of these scenarios you can represent just by a sort of vector, which characterizes the number of the 20 different types of people on each side of the road, right? So in this case, you have, kids, older people. Well, this is so that they're distinguished by gender, age, and other categories. So this is a young girl, an older woman, a dog, a baby, a woman, and another dog, right? So you can sort of make a little vector, which is the counts of people from these different categories that appear on each side of the road. And then you could put together a sort of simple rational choice model, which assumes that there's some utility that people assign to each of these sets of people. And that utility could be something like adding up a utility, which is associated with individuals from each category, times the number of instances of people from that category, and then have a sort of softmax model that tells you what's the chance people will choose one side of the road or the other. So this sort of very simple utilitarian model might be a starting point. But you can also extend this using more deontological principles, so sort of rules that people might apply to the things that they think are sort of acceptable in these circumstances, such as people are known to favor people who are crossing the road legally. So if you're crossing the road legally, it's more morally acceptable. If you've got a choice between hitting somebody who's crossing the road legally and hitting somebody who's crossing the road illegally, it's more morally acceptable to hit the person who's crossing themselves illegally, because intuitively they put themselves in peril as a consequence of doing that. We also know that people prefer not to swerve. So this is a bias against taking actions that have negative consequences. People prefer to not act in those circumstances. And you can introduce those as basically additional terms that appear in this equation, where we'd have an extra weight that might be assigned to each of these things and an extra feature for each scenario that indicates whether that feature applies in that scenario. And so we end up with a sort of, soft max end kind of model that's motivated from this mix of utilitarian and deontological principles. Okay, so this is our psychological model. And then we can contrast that with a black box model, which in this case will be our neural network, just taking these same vectors of the number of people on each side of the road. As you might expect, with 10 million data points, the neural network is ultimately going to win this contest. Here, the way we're going to measure performance is in terms of the accuracy of predicting the choices that people make. And here, we're varying again on this axis, the data set size. So this is how well you do in predicting people's choices if you have a model which just assigns equal weight to all of the different types of agents that could appear on the road. You can make that better by having separate weights for animals and people, reflecting the fact that people put greater moral weight on human lives than animal lives. You can do even better if you have a sort of generalized utilitarian model where you allow those weights to be different for all of those 20 different categories. And you can do even better if you have an expanded model that also incorporates the deontological principles that I mentioned. But you can do even better than that if you just train this neural network to predict which choice people will make based on these vectors of the number of people of different types appearing on either side of the road. Okay, so now the question we have, same problem as before, is what's going on here? What's the difference that's accounting for this additional variance that's being captured by the neural network? And a standard way of critiquing a model is to look at the errors that it makes and then try and figure out if there is something that you're missing, right, that you can do to make the model work better. The problem is when you've got 10 million data points and you look at the errors that a model makes, most of those errors end up being noise. So this is what happens if we look across these scenarios and we look at the scenarios where you have the biggest gap between the model prediction and what people actually do. And so what we see here is the top one here is a situation where you've got a bunch of people on one side of the road, a bunch of animals on the other side of the road, and the data says that 99.4% of people chose to kill the humans rather than the animals, right? And our choice model says that, no, that's a bad decision. It predicts that only 11.5% of people should make that decision. Okay, so what's going on here? We have no idea what's going on here, right? We contacted the people who ran the survey. They have no idea what's going on there either. It seems like it was maybe a bug or something went wrong or something got flipped or we don't know what's going on, right? But that's the thing that accounts for the biggest deviation, right? It's a situation where, like some random thing happened, right? And often it can be really hard to make sense of these things if we just focus in on what's the biggest deviation between the model and the data. But an interesting thing to observe is that this is a situation where both the choice model and the neural network agree, right? So even though the choice model is really wrong here, it's not that much more wrong than the neural network. And so as a consequence, this error isn't one that we should really care about that much, right? And so this motivated us to think about this idea of scientific regret minimization, that we should only be concerned about the errors that could have been predicted. And our black box model tells us what were the errors that we could have predicted because it is predicting things and getting them right where we're getting them wrong. And so this led us to a sort of radical idea, which is, what if we treated our black box model as the truth rather than treating the data as the truth? What if we train our black box model, threw away the data, and we just critique our theoretical model with respect to the black box model? And the intuition behind this is that if you've got enough data, what this is doing is your black box model, you're living in an interpolation domain, right? If you're just sort of thinking about these scenarios where you've already got data, so it's already in the interpolation domain. Your black box model is just smoothing out that curve that characterizes the thing that you're interested in. And so as a consequence, it's sort of removing all of the stuff, which is the noise variation, and giving you a better signal as to the things that the model is actually getting wrong. And that intuition you can justify sort of more mathematically, right? So here's the idea, right? You've got your data set, there's some true underlying function, your neural network model, which is trained on the data and sort of producing some kind of smooth version of that. And you can actually show, if you try and decompose the sources of variance that go into this data set, that there's a regime where the variance that you get, so if we compare the error that we get from the true function plus noise compared to our theoretical model, right? And we sort of look at the sources of variance that contribute to this. One is how wrong our theoretical model is compared to the true function. Then the other is the noise, which is in that true function. Whereas if we compare our theoretical model to our estimated function that comes out of our neural network, then there's one term here, which is the gap between the true function and the theoretical model in the same way. but the other terms here correspond to the, these are basically sort of measures of the extent to which these errors are correlated between the machine learning model and the theoretical model, and then what the overall error of the theoretical model is. And there's a regime where these errors are smaller than the variance which is due to noise. And that regime is the one that you enter when you've got enough data that you're able to accurately estimate in the interpolation regime the form of that underlying function. And so this is showing that this actually happens in data. So if we take this problem and then we look at this is like a second order thing. So I'm going to explain it. I'm going to try and say it a few times, make sure I get it right. Okay, it's that what we're plotting here is the correlation that exists between either the true residuals and the neural network, right? So the true residuals are the residuals between the true function and our theoretical function and the neural network. That's the blue line. And then this is the true residuals. So the residuals that exist between the true function and our theoretical function versus the residuals that you have to the actual data, right? So this is if we measure residuals to the neural network. This is if we measure residuals to the actual data. There's a regime where you get a better correlation of the true residuals to the neural network than if you were measuring the residuals to the data, right? And you get into that regime at the point where the average mean squared error that's produced by the neural network to the true function is smaller than the noise variance, right? The residuals from the actual observed data to the true function. Okay, I got through that. Okay, good. All right. So the basic idea here is if you have enough data, you can train a black box model on the data and then throw away the data and then use that as a means for critiquing your model. Okay, so if we do that now and we look at what are the errors that are the biggest errors that our theoretical model was making when we compare it to the neural network model, it becomes extremely clear what are some of the features that that model is missing. So what we see is, if you look at all of these are all cases where you have a human on one side of the road, an animal on the other side of the road, and people choose to save the human and kill the animal, right? So feature number one is, in any of these situations, you want to have this extra bonus for, like if you've got a choice like this, you want to save the humans, not worry about the animals. Okay. And now you can do the same thing again. And you can try, make a model that has that extra feature in it, estimate that model, calculate the residuals. And then when we do this, and we look at the top residuals, so this is the top residuals on the left is to the data, and you still see it has this crazy thing as the biggest residual, right? On the right is to the neural network, and you can see we have animals crossing the road, in this case, animals crossing the road illegally, and then bank robbers crossing the road legally. And people think that in this circumstance, it's okay to hit the bank robbers, even though they're human beings. It turns out bank robbers don't get the human being feature. And then these are scenarios where children are crossing the road illegally and adults are crossing the road legally. And the model says that, you should hit the children in this circumstance because the bonus that you get for being a kid is offset by the decrement that you get for crossing the road illegally. But, you can figure out that this is a problem, right? That kids crossing the road illegally is not something. So you should penalize neither animals nor children for crossing the road illegally, right? And we do this again, we can figure out, this is bank robbers being less than animals, right? So this is that one already. This is pregnant women, it turns out, get an extra bonus, right? So that goes beyond the sort of soft bonuses we had. It needs to be a hard bonus. If you've ever got a choice between a side that has a pregnant woman on it and one that doesn't, then you get a big bonus for having a pregnant woman on the side. This is all information that you can use next time you're crossing a risky road, by the way. Okay. Anyway, as a result of going through this process, you end up with something that looks like this, which is, a really long list of all of the kinds of things that people are sensitive to when they're making these decisions. And in the paper, we went off and we took a bunch of these and we did additional experiments and we showed that these are things that actually influence people's decisions in these settings. And so you can kind of think about this as like 70 psychology papers that we compress into one by identifying all of these different factors that for each of those factors, you could have written one paper, which is like about the fact that, well, I'll tell you some of the weird things we find, right? So as a consequence of going through this, you can identify these very high order interactions, right? So a first order effect is crossing illegally increases your risk of being hit, right? So you can be aware of that. A second order is unless the crosses are children. I sort of showed you that example. And the third order is if those children are with an adult, then it becomes more morally acceptable to hit them again, right? And so this is stuff that you discover as a consequence of going through those different effects. You also find weird stuff that, if you were advising somebody on the way that they should build a self-driving car to solve these problems, you might not suggest that they incorporate into their self-driving car. So if you look at a situation where you have somebody crossing the road, it's unclear whether they're crossing the road legally or illegally. If it's a woman, then the rate at which people make the choice that it's okay to hit them is exactly in between the rates of hitting legally or illegally. As you might expect, they're sort of averaging out that uncertainty. If it's a man, then they're essentially not given the benefit of the doubt and assumed to be crossing the road illegally, right? And so this is a weird quirk about the way that people seem to think about this interaction of gender and legality, but it's something where, again, we might differentiate the things on the top from the things on the bottom in terms of whether you want to build self-driving cars in a way that's sensitive to those different features. Your question?
The number of elements in the two parts is always the same. Is that something that was controlled for?
Yeah, it's a way of balancing it out. Yeah.
But that's what the data set has?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's now go back to the risky choice setting. And we now have the equipment that we need to sort of look at the setting. And so what we did in the setting is now take the risky choice task and, in the same way, look at the scenarios like this that were most diagnostic of the difference between our black box neural network model and in this case, the sort of psychologically interpretable model we critiqued against was a prospect theory model. Okay, so we could say, where is the neural network doing better than prospect theory? And what does that tell us about what's going on? And what happens when you do that is that you realize that, in fact, the prospect theory model is pretty good, except it's not uniformly applied within the space. And so the model we end up with is something we call a mixture of theories. And the way that it works is we say, let's allow two kinds of utility functions. One utility function, which is, ends up being a symmetric one, and one that ends up being like this prospect theoretic one. These are actually estimated from the data. And we'll have two probability weighting functions, one which is perfectly linear and one which is allowed to deviate from linearity. And we end up with it estimating this one. And then for every point in the space, right, for every choice between two gambles, we're going to have now a neural network that just learns how much weight to put on each of these components. So it's going to put a different amount of weight. It's sort of going to choose which of these utility functions it wants to use, and it's going to choose which of these probability weighting functions it wants to use. And so what that's basically saying is, across our space of decisions, we're going to allow loss aversion to vary in the extent to which it's applied, and we're going to allow probability weighting to vary in the extent to which it's applied. And what you find is that allowing this non-homogeneity is sufficient, right? So this is actually showing now the curve. This is, if we try and estimate this mixture of theories model, it can be estimated from far less data, and it ends up fitting better than our context-dependent model, even as we get to 100% of our data set. And it's just saying, use that prospect theoretic formulation, but allow for non-homogeneity in the extent to which these things are used. And so there are some problems where these are colored by which probability weighting function is used, right? So mostly the linear probability weighting function gets used, but there are some problems where people do tend to overestimate these small probabilities. And then there's most problems demonstrate loss aversion, but there are some subsets of these problems that don't show loss aversion where this sharp utility function is used. And we can also look at the instances of problems that have these characteristics. Basically, it's predicted by things like sort of how complex these decisions are, and also for things like the sharpness of that utility function, how close problems are to being dominated, right? So if you have something where it's close to a dominated choice, you're just sensitive to what the differences are in those values and not necessarily whether it's losses or gains. So this is what I was saying at the start. This is a different way of thinking about theories, right? We're not asking, is prospect theory right? We're asking, where do these phenomena of loss aversion and probability weighting manifest in the space of decisions. And so rather than setting this up as a choice of, is it this theory or is it that theory, we're asking, where are these theoretical properties correct in the decisions that people make? Okay, so Cody had a question about individual differences. We can now do individual differences in this model. What we're doing is estimating a different weighting function for individuals, right? And so we have different estimated utility functions, probability weighting functions for those individuals, and then they differ in the weights that they end up assigning to those functions. And this is from a second data set that we collected where we have about 1,000 decisions per individual. Okay, so more broadly, the approach that I've been outlining here is one that we can use for thinking about all sorts of other kinds of problems that come up in studying decision-making, thinking about psychology. It gives us a framework for thinking about how to build models that have inductive biases, that are good inductive biases for explaining human behavior. The formula that goes into that is one where we collect way more data than we might normally have collected. We use psychological theories to guide us in the classes of models that we consider. And we use black box models to critique those psychological theories and figure out what the factors are that we might be missing. And at the end of that, we end up with something which is a differentiable, flexible model, but one that instantiates insights that come from that psychological literature about the kinds of things that we might want to build into our models of decision making. How well this works, the effectiveness of increases with bigger and better black boxes, right? So that means we want to have a lot of data. We also want to have good black box kinds of methods. Okay, so I talked about these three methods. It's worth saying, when I sort of talked about inductive bias, these kinds of ways of thinking about formulating machine learning problems are now being faced with an alternative way of thinking about formulating machine learning problems, which is maybe all of these problems can be solved just by using large language models and applying them to everything. And so it's interesting to ask how large language models do in the settings that I've been talking about. It turns out, first of all, if you just take an off-the-shelf large language model and ask it to generate predictions about human behavior in these decision tasks that I've been talking about, they don't do very well. This is a paper. Ryan here was an undergraduate here at CMU. What he found when he applied these models to our choice data set was that they make a very interesting kind of error, which is that they essentially assume that people do expected value computations, right? So if you ask a large language model to generate a prediction about the probability that people will make a particular choice, they perform poorly because they have sort of two failure modes, one in which they disregard probabilities completely. We don't know why they do that. But the other in which they just assume that people are going to make decisions based on expected value. That is a problem that is not solved by using chain of thought or other kinds of reasoning methods. If you use chain of thought, it just makes them even more rational. So they just reduce completely to expected value. The best way that we found of making these models make predictions that line up with human judgments was to say, a monkey is making a decision between these two options. And that turned out to work quite well. Okay. Consistent with this, if you train a language model architecture just on expected value computations, it performs just as well as these off-the-shelf large language models. So you can take those models and you can fine-tune them. Fine-tuning does help. So Marcel Binz and Eric Schultz have a nice paper where they fine-tune a language model on our task and end up getting performance that's similar to what we can get from multi-layer perceptrons on that task. That motivated a big crazy paper where that kind of fine-tuning method is applied not just to this one data set, but to a huge range of different kinds of decision problems and related kinds of tasks. And in that setting, the fine-tuned model, which is called Centaur, because it's half llama, half human, it's fine-tuned on okay, ends up doing better than psychological models that have been developed within those specialized tasks. Okay. So conclusions, psychological theory can be used to create models with good inductive biases for predicting human behavior. I talked about two ways of doing this, theory-based pre-training and using these kinds of differentiable decision theories. Machine learning can be used to guide the development of better explanations for that behavior via scientific regret minimization. But I think a really interesting point in the context of the sort of sociology of science here is that the explanations that we end up with as a consequence of doing this look different from the kinds of explanations that we're used to in psychology. It's one theory. It's three factors. We have these different things that are trading off against one another, and you need 70 of these factors in order to explain how it is that people are thinking in these moral reasoning settings. And so I think one of the things that has to happen as we end up getting more data about human decision-making is also getting more comfortable with the kinds of theories we use to explain those data being things that are more complicated. Thank you very much. I showed these names as we went through the talk, but Josh Peterson and Mayank Agrawal were leads on a lot of the papers that I talked about. These are the other co-authors on this series.
Time for a few questions. Anybody has questions? Also open it up for the online crowd too.
So yesterday's talk was about the constrained cognitive resources, and it's kind of like less is more story. And today's talk is more of a more is more story, like we're gonna throw insane amounts of data at the model and come up with some super complicated picture model. So how can I put those two ideas together?
Yeah. Well, first of all, demanding that I be consistent is, that's a high bar. No, I mean, I think the way that I think about that is that this is a reason why we actually need AI to help us in making sense of human behavior, is that if we're going to make sense of the complexity of human behavior, that's going to require us to use more data, and it's going to require us to have tools that allow us to search through these complex spaces of theories, right? And so that's kind of what I was doing here with the using automatic differentiation to search this space of theories and end up discovering things that took humans, decades to discover, right? But I think it's an opportunity that's even more than that as we start to work with other bigger, more complex data sets where our own capacity to come up with good theories is, constrained, and we need to use tools that'll help us figure that out. Yeah.
One minor comment and one question. So I really enjoyed all of this. The minor comment, as an ethics professor, I always get worried when people use the moral machine experiment to make normative claims. And I think we all agree that we shouldn't be hitting women over men or old people over babies and so on, right?
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be using it at all to make decisions. So this is just understanding human bias in some interesting way. But the question is, do you think we could do the same kind of thing in ethical decision-making, i.e. creating this interesting black box function and then trying to go in and find out when are people being utilitarians, when are they being deontologists, under what situations? Do you think we could do that kind of thing that you were doing with the economic decision?
Yeah. So that's exactly a mixture model setting, right? Like the one that I was showing at the end here. And that's an approach that we've used in the context of some of these other tasks too. So I have colleagues who are actually thinking about this in moral reasoning settings. In this paper, this is looking at decisions people make in the game theoretic setting, and we end up with essentially something like a mixture model where it's essentially you either think one iteration or two iterations, and what predicts whether it's one or two is something like the complexity of the scenario that you're evaluating, right? And so I think you could do a similar kind of thing for those kinds of moral decisions.
Great.
Yeah. Yep.
So I love this approach. It's a really interesting one, and it's obviously giving us a great deal of information. When I look at something like the moral decisions, it occurs to me that context, one lesson from psychology is context is everything. So if people are making them under time constraints, or they're making them under cognitive load, or they make one choice versus they make 30, and so they start to develop some policy that might not have existed for a single choice, or when there's stress, which there would be out of the situation. There's so many different factors, and you're saying, well, let's go get 30,000 observations or 1 million observations, but it's still going to be constrained by the contextual variation that we throw into the studies to begin with. And I'm wondering, I guess, how do we identify, using a black box theory approach that you're doing, what are the constraints that we should be throwing in the studies?
Yeah, so I don't think you can, right? So we have a paper that sort of outlines this more general paradigm. Abdullah Al-Matouk's the first author. It's with Abdullah and Jordan Suchow, James Evans, and Duncan Watts. So that paper talks about this as the design space, right? Because this is an approach that works in situations where you have a sufficiently mature experimental paradigm that you think you know what the relevant factors are, right? And so that then allows you to say, these are the parameters of that design space, and now we can start exploring within that design space instead of trying to map this out. This doesn't replace a lot of traditional psychology, which is doing the work of figuring out what that design space is in the first place, right? So a motivation for doing those more traditional, I got this and this, and I want to see if this has any kind of effect on that, right? Is to work out, yeah, what those dimensions look like. And that's, I think the best method we have for solving that problem is still human ingenuity. But then once we get past that point and we're sort of like, okay, we kind of know what's going on here. Now let's figure out what the answer is. You're ready to go. Yeah.
You know ways in which like machine learning can assist in the search for the design space itself. Like you have like LLMs, for example, are like so broadly capable in terms of what they can consider.
Yeah. Yeah. We have some studies we're doing at the moment where we look at reverse engineering capabilities in LLMs, and they are sort of okay, but not great at that, right? Where it's like trying to figure out a function from examples where it's creating interventions as well. So I think they're not quite at the point where I would lean on them for doing that. Obviously, a lot of the factors that we come up with when we're doing these as psychologists are familiar kinds of factors as well. And so I think just, enumerating hypotheses is something that models could do, but I'm not sure how well they can do in that iterative mode of, sort of based on all the things we know so far, come up with a new thing. Yeah.
So this may be sort of a add-on, echoing previous comments and questions. So if I understood the logic correctly, the black box model is taking the observed data, denoising it, which gives you a clearer baseline to evaluate different theories.
Yeah.
But isn't it also possible that the raw data, the noise is not just noise, so there could be signal importance of noise.
Yeah.
But by using the black box model and denoising it, we could get rid of all of those possibilities, I think, for new theory construction, expanding those the space of parameters and dimensions to consider.
Yeah. So I think this is related to Danny's question about, what the features are, right? So that method works to the extent that the features that are relevant can be constructed from whatever you're using as the raw input to the black box model, right? So all of the kinds of features that I talked about are things that the neural network can figure out by combining the information about who is on the different sides of the road. And, as long as that's sufficient to express the features that you think are relevant, then it's okay to do that, right? But if there are things that are not expressed in the they can't be expressed through combinations of the things that go into the black box model, they're going to be treated as noise by the black box model, and you're going to miss them. Yeah.
So then, does that approach reduce the possibility of serendipity?
I don't think so under the conditions that I just stated, right? That you're not going to miss seeing something that, I think you're potentially missing an opportunity to look at something weird and have an idea that's unrelated to the fact that it's noise, right? So maybe that's serendipity. Yeah. So okay, I'll concede that there is a kind of serendipity that you might be missing. Yeah. but it's kind of like error-driven serendipity. Yeah. Questions?
Let's thank Tom again.
Okay. Thank you.